what things come to mind when you think of Bawsey?
Well, it was the first time team that I'd ever been involved with, and it was the first live, wasn't it? So
Yeah.
everybody was in this big learning curve, and I was a local finds expert, you know, from the museum, from Norwich Castle Museum, and I was there to, you know, do a bit of digging maybe, but also mainly to bring the finds and to explain them, the old finds. So I was talking to Sandy Toksvig a lot of the time, and she seemed to be just about the only person who was totally calm, totally experienced, totally everything. And I just used, when I was doing bits with her, I would just stare into her eyes, and she would somehow communicate to me when I should shut up, when I should carry on. And I remember saying to her, how do you know? How do you learn how to do this? And she said, oh, I've just done a lot of it. And I thought, oh, that's no help. But I'm afraid now when people say things to me about all sorts of things like finds or whatever, they say, how do you know? And I say, oh, well, I've just seen a lot of it. And I realise I'm using that excuse now. I don't know how I know to do what I do, but it's so wonderful being in the hands of someone who's completely experienced and completely knowledgeable. You can just relax.
And when you said you brought the old finds along, what can you remember about what those finds were?
Well, one of the really interesting things is that they included a lot of Stylee. So those Stylus is not like a gramophone stylus. It's quite a kind of pencil-sized object of metal, often with small bits of decoration on, but they're really quite functional, and they're used to make marks in wax tablets. So that it's a way of writing notes. In the days before paper, you could make a quick note with them. So they're objects of literacy, and the concentration of Stylee at Bawsey was not like anywhere else apart from Whitby. You know, Whitby with St Hilda and the Synod of Whitby and all that kind of stuff going on in the 7th century. And there are a couple of other places thought to be monasteries that have also got lots of Stylee, but Bawsey was never known. You know, it's a completely unknown, unrecorded site, yet producing all this stuff that made it look like a centre of literacy, maybe a monastery.
And a couple of things. What date are we talking about? And can you explain what use it would be to make marks on a piece of wax? What's the process of, if I'm a knowledgeable monk chatting away and I want someone to record what I'm saying, how does the process of writing on wax then become something which can be saved even if it's a hot day or whatever?
That's a good point. The wax is poured into little recessed wooden tablets so that you've got some protection for it, and you use the wax. Well, it starts off in the Roman world. There are Roman wax tablets known, and there's the background, the wooden background is known from places like Vindolanda with scratches on it, which can be read. So if you're writing with a very hard pressure, sometimes the scratches can go through to the wooden background. So they're in use in the Roman world. And then they come back into use with literacy coming back in the Anglo-Saxon world with Christianity. And it seems that monasteries which own land, which have a way of, I mean, if you're going to have a monastery, you've got to pay for it. So the only way that you can pay for it really is by endowing the monastery with land, and then the people who work the land give some of their money in rent or in tax or whatever you want to call it, in a charge to support the monastery. And the monastery needs to know how much it's getting, so it needs to keep accounts. Also, Christianity is a religion of the book. It has the Bible, it has other writings, and it has service books, and it has hymn books, and it has psalters, and it has this, that, and the other, books of sermons. It's also a source of learning. So we have all the books that Bede wrote. Now, if you're going to sit down and write something like the Lindisfarne Gospels, you don't really want to be using your expensive parchment to lay it out, etc. So you might use your wax tablet. So there's all sorts of places, all sorts of reasons you'd use these wax tablets, from drafting something really important to making a note that someone's paid you.
So when you've made a mark on wax, is it does it set, and is it hard enough to last for it, or do you put some paper over it and somehow get a print off it, which would be backwards? I mean, how long does a piece of a wax tablet last?
Well, it's interesting that you ask that, because there's been a controversy going around for about the last 20 years as to whether you can have a bone stylus. So all the ones that we accept as Stylee, can't be anything else, are made of metal. And people have said, well, they have to be made of metal because they have a kind of expanded end, a triangular expanded end that is known as the eraser. And the idea is that you warm this up, say in a cup of hot water or something, and you use it to erase your tablet, and then you can start again. And the bone, well, that wouldn't be possible, would it? Now, I had to write a guide to identifying Stylee a couple of years ago, just at the same time as we started keeping bees. So I suddenly had access to wax. And I did some experiments, and what I couldn't believe was that no one seems to have done these before. So I got an old, I had an old bronze needle, and so I wasn't using steel to scratch into it, and I got and sharpened an uncooked bone. So I was making a bone. I made a bone stylus as well. And what I discovered was, if you rub like with a rubber, you presumably generate a bit of heat with your bone eraser, and it works absolutely fine to erase your scratches. I mean, the reason why I keep looking to the side down here is because my bit of wax and my stylus are somewhere on my disgustingly cluttered desk. Well, this is a thin piece of beeswax, which we melted and poured into, I mean, it's cracked now, but I poured it into a plastic tray. And so I had my thin piece of wax. And then I don't know where this thing came from, probably found it in the garden. It's some kind of bronze needle. And I tried writing, I don't know whether you can see this, but you can try writing, making marks in the wax. Now, everybody agrees that these things, that a copper alloy point with an eraser on the end, not that this has really got one, would work perfectly well. And indeed, I managed to write, I mean, I think you can probably see hello, or, you know, I can see hello written there. Then I got a bit of old bone out of the hedge, probably. One of my sons really likes digging up long dead animal skeletons, so he probably found this somewhere. And that's got a sharp point. So I tried that. It's also got some rounded bits. One of the controversies is whether some bone objects with rounded ends could be used as erasers. And then I had another bit that was more kind of wide. And the aim was to see if unheated bone could erase what you'd written. And I found that by doing kind of rubbing hard like that, it does smear the surface well enough. I mean, presumably it generates some heat through friction. It does that well enough to I've crossed out my hello. And I think looking at this, I can see right at the top, I've written something like, writing works with wood as well. So I've obviously found a toothpick or something and tried that, which kind of underlines the idea that if you can write effectively with a wooden stylus onto wax that's on wood, would we ever know that people had been doing it? So absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and it's only these metal things that that survive well enough for us to be absolutely sure that people are writing. So at Bawsey, we know people were writing. It doesn't mean we don't know that people weren't writing elsewhere.
So do you see the wax tablet as a sort of cheaper, erasable alternative to using presumably vellum?
Yes, but I wouldn't necessarily say cheaper. If you think about something like one of those really expensive notebooks you could get, are they called moleskin or something? You can, I don't imagine they're wrapped in real moles. And you remember filofaxes years ago? What you make ephemeral notes on can also be very high class. And there are some ivory wax tablet backers, if you see what I mean. They're not always wooden. You can get them made out of walrus ivory or even elephant ivory. So they're for ephemeral notes, not necessarily cheap. I mean, wax, one of the things that we wonder about with bees is whether when you kept bees, it was really the honey you were aiming for or really the wax you were aiming for, because wax had so many uses in the ancient world.
And as we've been talking about, one of the uses are if you've got beeswax candles, they smell wonderful, and the light is a kind of glowing yellow light.
Yeah.
Also, honey could be part of a bonding material with mixing sap from trees to create something quite hard as a kind of glue. Medical uses,
Yes.
Drinks, a nice glass of mead.
Yes. It's there's so many uses. The bee in the past is really very understudied, I feel.
So going back to Bawsey, we've got this Stylee, and that was giving us a date of when about.
Well, all you know about Stylee is they're not found in graves, in furnished graves, which stop around 700 AD. That may not be because necessarily of date. It may be because they're not appropriate to put in graves, of course. So we know that we guess that they start after about 700, but it would be odd if someone like Bede wasn't using one before that. So 650, 700, and they carry on in different ways. The classic one carries on until the Viking attacks, when monasteries, there's a death of learning that Alfred complains about so much. They then get replaced by other shapes of stylus later on, but they're never as common. So Middle Anglo-Saxon England is the great flowering of the use of the stylus.
And we have here evidence in the case of the Bawsey site of the violence meted out by people who clearly didn't have a problem having a go at a religious establishment. Is this area particularly vulnerable to attacks from the sea and Vikings coming in and attacking places like this?
Yes, it's hugely vulnerable because it's very close to the sea. I don't know the detail of how easy it is to sail up to, but I seem to remember Stuart doing an analysis, Stuart and Henry maybe doing an analysis of the depth of water, how close you could sail up to. So I think that must be known. And of course, King's Lynn, I'm pretty sure there wasn't any settlement at King's Lynn there, so they didn't have to get past anything to get to Bawsey. The trouble with the skull that's had the cut into it is that I don't know, I haven't seen the details of how we know what date it is. Has it been carbon dated? You need to see the graph kind of has a rise and a fall, and so you can see the probability of any particular date along the timeline. She was clearly there between circa 700 when the site seems to begin and circa the Vikings when it seems to end, but I don't know at what point in that. But the really interesting thing about the Middle Anglo-Saxon period is this is anyway when we begin to get more evidence of violence. Now that is really counterintuitive, because you know how early Anglo-Saxon graves are often buried with weapons. You almost never find any evidence of actual violence on the skeletons. When you get a cemetery which has got more than one sword cut to the head, and I appreciate that Bawsey doesn't come into this group, when there's evidence of significant amounts of violence, that cemetery is always later. It's always Middle or Late Anglo-Saxon.
This brings me to the wonderful picture that Victor did on the site. One thing that really used to get Victor's enthusiasm going was when he had a chance to produce a horse in the drawing.
Horse or a ship, that's what
a
Victor
horse
loved.
or a ship, and this is in Recreating the Past, which is a marvelous book.
Yes.
And I remember him referring as someone with a good knowledge of Hungarian history. He referred to the backward blow that a horse rider might deliver to somebody, which enabled him to sort of cut backwards. Margaret subsequently discovered that this person who we thought was a male victim was actually female, which suggested she might have been a nun. And the blow to her head went through, in Margaret's fantastic analysis, a series of events. And can you remember some of those and how that sequence went, which Victor actually in the following pictures reveals somewhat gruesomely? Can you remember that sort of sequence and how we ended up with a male victim attacked from a horse, and then the following page she became a nun, but had been clearly dealt a pretty gruesome blow, which sort of took off part of her skull?
Well, I think that the sequence of events went like this, and I have to stress I've got this from Victor's book rather than from reading the actual report. I think the sequence of events goes like this: that first of all, Margaret establishes that this is a woman, and therefore the story begins to change from a almost organized violence, you know, like a melee or a fight, to an attack. If she's a woman buried on site at Bawsey, maybe she's part of the community, maybe she's a nun. Anglo-Saxon monasteries were more likely to have women in them than ones in other places. Women in high up roles within the community. So then Victor draws this wonderful picture of a nun in full wimple running away from a marauding attacker with unkempt hair and a bushy beard. Sounds like many people on Time Team. So who's dealing a mighty, also probably Hungarian blow to the back of her head. But then the next thing, after establishing that the skeleton is female, Margaret then establishes that it's not a single blow, it's a series of cuts, which implies a surgical operation rather than violence. And then that's coupled with moving down off the skull into the rest of the body, that the body has been gnawed, the bone has been gnawed by a badger at some point. So we're into a very strange sequence of events where before death, but at the point of death, you know, the bone has not healed, but the bone was not post-mortem. It was still a fresh bone. Someone has chiseled off the top of the head, which is presumably a surgical operation, but has not buried the body, or in the really revolting kind of scenario that you have to wonder about, has the badger gnawing happened before the person received the operation? And the story that you begin to come up with is, has somebody collapsed but not died? A badger has then begun. It's almost like, you know, people who fall very ill and and can't feed their cat, and their cat begins to eat them.
I think perhaps at the moment, Helen, we better sort of
let's start again
a little bit. Okay, so on a more general point, what difference did it make to you as an archaeologist to have been looking at the evidence in the field, the styli and things, and knowing that we had this burial, and then to see in Victor's pictures the record, the portrayal of those events in drawings, which as an archaeologist is, you don't often get that, do you? You get a dry report and everything.
When you're working on a site like Bawsey, and you encounter something like this burial with the cut to the top of the head, what you tend to do is you see it as evidence, you see it as dating evidence, say. So you come across a burial and it's got a mighty great sword cut, as it looks, to the top of the skull, and you think, oh, that's good, that's some good solid dating evidence, I bet that's going to turn out to be Middle Anglo-Saxon. And you look at it as a job of work, you know, and so on and so forth, and you forget that actually this is a person who had a really horrendously horrific thing happen to them. And that's where Victor's, the process of Victor's drawings and the end product really helped you to to remember that these are real people, that you're studying people in the past, not just what happened when, and reconstructing settlement boundaries and that kind of thing, and activity patterns and settlement hierarchies. You know, this is actual people. These are societies. So, the sequence of drawings that Victor produced was shows the difficulty, I suppose, of his job, because he began thinking sword cut, probably a man, you know, violence tends to be a male thing. So he draws this amazing picture of a man on horseback, because that's quite a good way of getting up so high, you know, that somebody's reaching down from their horse and whacking a person, and that would remove this disc of, or slice the disc of bone. Works very well. Then Margaret Cox identifies the bones as those of a woman, and so Victor has to get another piece of paper and start again, because he's got to clothe her, he's got to give her the hairstyle or put a wimple on her. He's got to make her a woman, so he does another one. He takes a horse away, and he produces an attacker with a I better look at it actually. He produces an attacker with a sword high up, going for a sword cut to the woman there. Then Margaret has a further look and discovers that there's also a trepanation on this sword cut, which means that the person's likely to have survived for a bit, not in a very good state, or we can call her a woman now. The woman has survived, but her life is in danger, and her community is trying to save her. A trepanation or trepanation is done, it's a relatively simple operation as I understand it, and we have a lot of healed ones from various times, and it can be done for things like migraines. I suffer from migraines, and I can really imagine that somebody drilling into your skull would actually be preferable to the awful pain. And it's also done to try to relieve pressure, to try to solve blood clots, that kind of thing, we think. So this has been done to this woman, presumably while she's still alive, but she doesn't survive for long because there's no bone remodeling on the cut. And so Victor has drawn a third picture, which shows the community around this woman, with you know, trying to save her. And that conjures up life in a Middle Saxon monastery, with its ability to heal, with its literate culture that is there's probably people there who were reading the Greek theories of medicine, as well as having the Anglo-Saxon traditional medicines available. It gives you a picture of the monastery and life there in a way that most archaeologists don't get that far. We just stop at the evidence says this, and we never take it to tell a story. And Victor's drawings tell a story.
And it also introduced the idea, one hopes, of various medicines, perhaps something, some opiate-based or Valerian-based Anglo-Saxon medicine that could have at least dulled the pain of whatever was happening to her, that around her was clustered a community who'd just been attacked, and yet they had the bravery, I suppose, to ignore what might have been another attack and try and save it. There's a thing about value of life here, isn't there? Nobody was saying, that's it, she's been clobbered, and I'm afraid that's the end of her. Here, yes. They are making every attempt to save her in a post-battlefield situation.
Well, there are so many different stories that you could tell, because one interesting thought is, if this is a Christian community, and we know from what Bede tells us that one of the attractions of Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons was it gave them some certainty that they had not had before about what happens after death. Now, if this lady is from a Christian community, and everybody knows that after death she's going to go to be with Jesus, why aren't they just letting her die? That's one question. Another question is, well, you say a battlefield situation. We don't know the details of the date. We don't know the details of what happened at Bawsey. It could have been a Viking attack, but it could have been something else entirely. It could have been, for example, let me try this one out on you. The monasteries imposed on people, the local people have to pay for it. They don't think they necessarily like this new religion. It's maybe stopping them doing all sorts of things that they used to do and changing things. And they could rely on the old gods. How do they know that they can rely on the new one? Maybe the monastery's unpopular. Maybe it's just a random attack from somebody who thinks, I really don't like paying my taxes to this useless organisation. What has it ever given me?
I've got a feeling that a reaction to an overburden of taxes that involved somebody charging up to the monastery and clouting one of the nuns with a sword would have been a fairly exceptional act at the time, or was there a fairly strong degree of dislike of these sort of places?
Well, we don't know at this point. We know that there's a strong dislike 500 years later, when a lot of these monasteries really are very parasitical on the local communities. Near where I live in Bury St Edmunds, the townspeople burnt down part of the abbey in the early 1300s. We don't know at this stage, because we've got, in around 700, 800 AD, we've got very few detailed local chronicles, and of course Bawsey doesn't appear in anything.
And
one might say, well, you might think it might be likely, but you might also think that the people who write things down are the Christians, and they're not going to add this kind of information.
And that curve of your experience at Bawsey, did you end that program feeling like we had helped that process? We managed to find information about a site that wasn't well known. Did you feel it was a satisfying curve of exploration, if you like?
Yes, well, this is, yes, being on the other side, being a local person who sees the resources of Time Team moving in and doing in 3 days what we couldn't do in 3 years. I mean, if you think about it, it's been 22 years since Bawsey was excavated by Time Team, and we haven't learnt as much in the subsequent 22 years as we learnt in those 3 days. It was the only way you could get pure research done on a mysterious site. There's no way we could have interested a university in that. Time Team really did fill a gap that is now not filled. It's a tragedy that we can't still be getting these 13 3-day evaluations a year. Somebody has got to do something about it. But anyway, leaving that aside, the immediate aftermath of Bawsey, it was such an interesting experience seeing how a television program was made, and I had such fun on it. But one of the things I ended up doing was I was running across a field to get from one task to another when I heard a great shout from Carenza, who had been called to look at something somebody had been found. And so she could see it was a coin, but the Anglo-Saxon and the Iron Age coins look very similar, and there are a lot of Iron Age coins around there too. So there was this great shout, and I heard someone calling my name and ran over to her, and Carenza said, "What is this?" And so I explained, and there was a camera there, and we filmed this little scene. And she said, "How much would it have been worth?" And I was dumbfounded. I had no idea whether it could have bought 2 cows or half a cow or 30 cows. So I kind of looked dumbfounded at her. I said, "Well, it's not your loose change." And I got so teased about this. For about 6 months afterwards, every time somebody, I asked somebody, I'd be at work and open a bag of objects and I wouldn't know what something was. So I'd go to a colleague and say, "Have you got any idea what this is?" And they'd go, "Well, it's not your loose change." And it followed me around for months, that little moment. So that was one annoying thing. But on the whole, the experience of knowing what it's like when Time Team rolls into town later in life, when I joined Time Team, you realised what a what a fantastic resource it is, and how grateful every community is for having those resources there, just for 3 days maybe, but the amount that gets done in 3 days is staggering.